Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, last week, the long-awaited autopsy into Labour's defeat at the general election was finally published. The report by Margaret Beckett concluded that Ed Miliband wasn't judged to be as strong a leader as David Cameron and that Labour had failed to shake off the myth, as she called it, that Labour was responsible for the financial crash. But parallel research was also commissioned to inform the Beckett Report, and despite being completed in July, its findings remain unpublished. The former Labour pollster, Deborah Mattinson, carried out this research, and she's spoken exclusively to the Sunday Politics. Here's Ellie.
We are saying the Conservatives are the largest party.
We all know what happened on election night. The opinion polls got it wrong. Instead of a hung parliament, David Cameron walked back into Downing Street with a majority of 12. Labour got it wrong too, suffering a net loss of 26 seats.
Friends, this is not the speech I wanted to give today.
Ed Miliband resigned within hours, but it's taken 8.5 months for the party to publish its own inquiry into what went wrong. Margaret Beckett's report is called Learning the Lessons from Defeat. It doesn't, says one pollster who's worked for several former Labour leaders.
I think it was a whitewash and I think it was a massive missed opportunity.
Just a few weeks after the election defeat, Deborah Mattinson was commissioned by the acting leader Harriet Harman to research why Labour lost. She says the evidence was meant to feed into the Beckett Report, but it hasn't.
I did brief Margaret Beckett, so I was somewhat disappointed not to see some of that reflected back. Yes, I think that she picked up on the economy, but there was actually no analysis. It's reduced down effectively to one bullet point in the report, and in fact there's a lot of quite defensive stuff about, you know, this doesn't necessarily mean that anti-austerity is wrong. It doesn't, of course we had a great business strategy. What a pity that the voters didn't notice it. It was probably the fault of the media. So quite apologetic, lots of defensive stuff in there, but nothing that actually really, I felt, shone a light on what had gone wrong.
Do you accept that when Labour was last in power, it overspent?
No, I don't. And I know you may not agree with that.
Margaret Beckett's report acknowledges Labour failed to shake what she describes as the myth that the party caused the financial crisis. But she concludes that Labour was not seen as anti-aspiration and its policies were not unpopular. Deborah Mattinson says for people in her focus groups, it was the economy stupid.
Frankly, they didn't trust Labour to manage the economy effectively. They were very concerned about that. In their minds, they are seeing a conflation between the financial crisis, which, by the way, they do categorically blame Labour for, rightly or wrongly.
6 years after the financial crisis hit the world economy, tighter rules are being proposed to prevent the big banks from ever being bailed out by the taxpayers again. The Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, told a meeting of regulators in Switzerland today that the plans are a watershed moment and will force banks to hold substantially more capital. He's been speaking exclusively to our business editor, Kamal Ahmed.
He told me taxpayer bailouts would become a thing of the past.
Let's face it, the system we've had up until now has been totally unfair. The banks and their shareholders and their creditors, those big institutions that hold their debt, got the benefit when things went well, but when things went wrong, the British public, you and I, and subsequent generations have picked up the bill.
Events today at this drab and admittedly rather wet building in Basel, Switzerland might seem an awful long way from the real needs of the UK economy. But of course, it was only because the taxpayer was forced to spend billions of pounds bailing out the banks in 2008 that the government is today carrying huge levels of public debt. It was only because the taxpayer was forced to spend billions of pounds bailing out the banks in 2008 that the government is today carrying huge levels of public debt. Of course, what's followed are spending cuts which have affected everybody.
And their sense that Labour would waste money, their money, and run the economy into the ground.
I'm not Tony Blair.
And that was part of the problem. Voters couldn't see him as PM.
I'm not Gordon Brown either.
But Margaret Beckett concluded that Ed Miliband faced an exceptionally vitriolic and personal attack by the media.
People looked at Ed Miliband and didn't see him as prime ministerial. And, you know, if you look at every election since the 70s, what you see is that the party that has the leader with the best ratings is the party that wins. There's no exception to that.
I get it, that people weren't prejudiced about immigration. People felt anxious and insecure. I get it, and I understand the need to change.
The Beckett Report acknowledges that Labour didn't quite get it on issues like immigration and benefits, and that the fear of the SNP propping up a minority government scared off many voters. But Deborah Mattison says Labour was losing support in Scotland well before the independence referendum and the surge in SNP support. Put simply, she says voters across Britain did not feel Labour was on their side, and the party still doesn't realise.
I feel very concerned that the lessons won't be learnt. I can't see how they will be learnt, because that was the vehicle, that was the moment, and if this report doesn't address those issues, then I'm not sure when they will be addressed. No political party has a divine right to exist, and you know, unless Labour really listens to those voters that it must persuade, it stands no chance of winning the next election.
Ellie Price reporting. We've been joined now by the former Shadow Cabinet Minister Michael Duggar. You might remember he was sacked by Jeremy Corbyn at the start of the month. Welcome to the Sunday Politics. Deborah Mattison says Margaret Beckett's report into why Labour lost the election is, quote, a whitewash. Is she right?
I think that's a bit harsh, to be honest. I think Margaret has produced a very good report. Does it have all the answers? No, of course not. And I think Deborah makes some very fair observations, you know, in the piece that you've just shown. But to be honest, what Margaret concludes in her report was not a massive shot to those of us that were knocking on doors last May and have thought very long and hard about it since, that we weren't trusted enough on the economy, and that was the big issue, but also on immigration and welfare. We were seen as out of touch. And of course, leadership being the most important thing in any race. She makes those conclusions, does Margaret, in her report. And I think the key thing now is that we listen to not just the issues that Margaret raises in her report, but we also listen to Deborah, and we listen to many others who've made a contribution since this report came out, because we've got to face up to those really difficult issues as to why we lost if we're going to win again.
Well, her research discovered that voters found Ed Miliband the personification of the Labour brand. It was his problem, well-meaning but ineffectual, unlikely to deliver on Labour's promises. Didn't any of you detect that at the time?
Of course, lots of private conversations. I was very close to Ed and gave him lots of advice. You know, some of it he took, some of it he didn't. You know, I wanted Ed to be a success. I saw him in private and knew how strong he could be, that often he got very unfair coverage in the media, and that sometimes he didn't do himself justice in his performances. We saw that he performed very well in the last few weeks of the campaign, but frankly, it's all too late by then. So the real lesson here for any leader of the Labour Party is, you know, all leaders have strengths and weaknesses. You've got to play to your strengths, but you've got to fundamentally address your perceived weaknesses, and you've got to do that early on.
But the private polling that you were getting showed the Tories in the lead, contrary to the public polls. Wasn't that a warning that things were going wrong?
Well, I'm not sure how much private polling I was shown, actually.
Did you not see these polls showing
no, I mean,
the Tories in the lead?
For certainly a year before the election, if you remember, I was appointed Shadow Secretary of State for Transport. You know, I wasn't so much part of the sort of central operation, so I didn't see private polling until then. A lot of us thought that, you know, we were getting difficult conversations on the doorstep, but we were told consistently, including by the pollsters, that we were neck and neck, and there was this perception that we were doing better in the marginals as well. Now, that turned out to be catastrophically wrong. But I think one of the things actually that isn't in Margaret's report is about some of the organisational lessons, because that does speak to, if you're going to have a million conversations, what are you doing with that data? What is it telling you? You know, I remember in the last few days of the campaign, when I was sent to Derbyshire, I was sent to Amber Valley. I was sent in Yorkshire to Elmet and Rothwell. I should have been sent to Morley to help Ed Balls. I should have been sent to Derby North to help Chris Williamson. Those are decisions any campaign has got to take based on the information they get in the last few days. But also, in 2010, we took very, very hard decisions, actually 6 months away from polling day, based on the information we had about prioritising resources. I'm not sure that happened either this time.
Well, Deborah Mattinson looks at the boundary changes that will be implemented before the next election, that the population are getting older and older people tend to be more conservative. It looks at Jeremy Corbyn and also what she thinks was the Beckett Report's failure to confront why you lost enough. Her conclusion is this, quote, Labour's future is in profound jeopardy. Is it?
I think we've got a massive challenge at the next election. I don't think any political party has a right to exist or a right to be successful in the future. Look, I'm by nature an optimistic person, though. Labour, you know, when we've got our act together, when we've been in touch with the public, we've shown that we can win, and we can win well in the past. I think we can win again in the future.
But is Labour's existence, continued existence, a question mark?
We've got to work really hard, starting right now, to get back in touch with the public. I think one thing that the report, Margaret's report, did slightly skirt around, and this does speak to some of Deborah's criticisms, that whole issue about the politics of identity. You know, there's a reference in terms of Scotland, some of the work John Cruddas and others were doing, but people like myself, you know, in England, where UKIP were the main challengers, have been banging on about this, not just, you know, in the weeks before the election, but for months and years before, you know, and we do need to face up to that. So, you know, no political party has a right to exist, but I think if Labour does get our act together, if we do get back in touch with the public, if we get after the Tories, if we stop picking fights with ourselves, if we face up to the difficult issues that are in this report and elsewhere, we can be successful in the future, absolutely.
Right. Well, there's a lot of ifs there. So in what ways, as things stand at the moment, what can you detect? In what ways will Labour be in better shape under Mr Corbyn heading into the 2020 election than it was in the 2015 election?
Well, what is one of the main conclusions from the Beckett report? It says, you know, we did make some gains, was it 1.5%, but we were stacking up support in areas where we were already strong, increasing our support
So
there.
in what ways will you be in better shape?
We've got to reach out. I mean, look, it's not rocket science, actually, at the most basic level. If they think you're out of touch on immigration and welfare, you better start talking about immigration and welfare.
Well,
that would
right.
be a good start.
Well, let's take these two issues. Mr Corbyn seems to want almost no limit on immigration. Certainly, it's hard to detect if he would have any limits. And he isn't at all interested in any welfare reforms. Indeed, he's rather against them.
Well, I'm not sure that that is an election-winning strategy. On immigration, look, I made this point to him actually at a Shadow Cabinet meeting. Firstly, I said, you've got to understand what a big issue this is. It's the second biggest issue on the doorstep nationally. It was in 2015, it was in 2010. It's the biggest issue in many constituencies, including mine. And I said, look, many of the answers to this actually about intervention in the labour market, about stopping the pressure down on wages and conditions. I said there are good centre-left solutions to dealing with these problems, about Europe providing more help for communities that are having these kinds of changes and need help with their public services. So I made the points to him on welfare. Look, he's right to say we should be standing up, you know, to help the most vulnerable, the disabled people. But in my experience, you only get heard on those issues if the public think you're for real in terms of wanting to be tough on people who, frankly, are making decisions not to go into work. So you've got to get the balance right.
Do you accept, given his huge support among party members, that Mr Corbyn will lead you into the next election?
I think Jeremy faces a big test in May because we've all seen the polls, we've all seen the personal ratings. The biggest test that any leader can actually go through is a real election, and this May Jeremy faces a very big test because he was very clear that a left-wing agenda, anti-austerity, is the key to transforming our fortunes in Scotland. I hope he's right. You know, I think we need to win in London, but we've got to show that we can make big gains in the rest of England as well, and we've got to hold on to power in Wales. So that's what I'll be working for every day from now until May. I hope he's successful.
Even if he fails these tests, do you seriously think there will be an attempt to remove him?
I think we've got to get behind Jeremy, and he's got to show us that he can deliver and that he can show that he can turn things around, that the Labour Party is heading in the right direction. I think we need to get behind him in doing that. Look, people are very clear about what Jeremy stands for.
You're not behind him.
He's achieved remarkable cut-through as Jeremy in the last few months. You know, I get it from people in the supermarket queue, in the local pub, you know, and over the next few months we'll see more of that. So he's got to be given his chance because he has got a huge mandate by the party members, but we've got to show show that he can turn that into real support from the public. And that means, I'm afraid, also winning the support of people who voted Conservative last time, people who voted for other political parties. It's not an easy challenge. We'll be behind him in that, but he's got to show that we can actually learn the lessons that Margaret Beckett has talked about, and also Deborah and others as well.
We have to stop it there. Thank you for being with us, Michael Duggar.
I've been getting away